The pharmaceutical industry is a complex and fascinating field. It takes countless of people to bring a high-quality product to the market. In the Qualitox podcast, I bring to you leaders, experts, and innovators who will share their experiences and explain to us how they do it. Welcome to the Qualitox podcast. I'm Kugel, host, and my guest today is Paul Palmer. Paul is a qualified person with many years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. He is also a business advisor and a pharmaceutical consultant. And today we're going to talk to him about deviations, planned and unplanned deviations, and how you should approach those, and why you should be really careful with planned deviations. So let's get to it. Paul, welcome to the Qualitox podcast. Honored to have you here again as always.
Thank you, Jan, and I'm glad to be here.
Our topic today is deviations. So, Paul, what types of deviations do we have and we need to take into consideration?
So, planned and unplanned are the type of deviations that many people use. However, I like to just look at the unplanned ones, really, because for me, the planned deviations are somewhere between a deviation and a change control. So it depends on how you've got your system set up, whether it becomes a deviation or whether it becomes a change control. So for the unplanned deviations, of course, it's when something goes wrong. Now, depending on the structure of your quality management system, it may be that your planned deviations are there to cope with certain requirements that you know are going to come along. If you know that you've got deviations from a specific process, then you'll put the details in place, and it's what you could also call a temporary change control. So a planned deviation is documented. You want to do it outside of the terms of the way that it's proceduralized, but then you want to put it back afterwards. So then that's how you do a planned deviation. The unplanned deviations are the ones where something goes wrong. So maybe you've got a test result out of spec, you've done your OS investigation and you confirm it's out of spec, and then you'd investigate it through an unplanned deviation. Or maybe somebody's failed to follow the SOP, something's gone wrong and you need to find out why. Maybe your product couldn't work at the end of it, maybe something preventing you taking it to the next stage in the process. Maybe you've got something that's looking like it's not going to be acceptable and you've caught it halfway through. So maybe the bulk testing identified the problem. You know you've got an out of spec and you raise the deviation to investigate. So you would then document what the problem was, look at how it happened, and work out how to resolve it. So an example of how to resolve it may be that you have another batch and it's maybe out of range in a different direction, and maybe you merge the two batches, maybe you mix them together to make one final bulk that does meet the requirements that you need. Now, if you want to, you can use non-conformances as well. So non-conformances are an approach which is product which has failed to meet the requirements, failed to meet the registered license details. Now, when I first started in quality, there wasn't such a thing as a deviation. Everything went through the non-conformances process. And then when deviations were introduced, it was about a failure to follow the system rather than a failure in the product parameters. Because as the introduction of more systems and processes came, when would it be? I think the ISO standard was introduced somewhere around 2002 into the pharmaceutical world, somewhere around there. It might have been a bit earlier or later. But I remember the quality management system requirements that were in the ISO standard being incorporated into the pharmaceutical requirements. And at that point, they needed a different way of managing the failures. And that's when deviations came into play. So if you have an unplanned deviation, what could it be? So it could be that somebody didn't follow the SOP the way it should be. But when you go and talk to them about it, you actually find that it's the SOP that's wrong, not the way that they're doing the process. So then the deviation would document what it is that they're doing wrong, identify what the reason behind it is, why they're having to do it in a different way to the way it's been documented in the procedure. And then you look at whether their way is the appropriate way, what you want to move to, or if you want to do something else. Update the SOP, update maybe the forms that go with it, retrain people, and then hopefully you get some consistency. But the important thing after you've done that is you want to check that what actions you've taken to fix it have been effective. So then you would be tracking your deviations and see if you get more of the same thing. And that comes to an interesting point, because deviations is part of your quality review. So when you're looking at deviations, you don't just want to look at them as a one-off. You want to look at trends. Now, if you've got an increasing number of deviations for the same part of the process, you don't want the quality system to be going out of control and just using deviations to correct it, to allow the product to go through the process. You want to make sure that your deviations, if you do see you're getting an increase in number of deviations for one particular problem, you use that trend to prioritize addressing the issue. Because sometimes you find that people just raise the deviation to be able to get the batch released. Yeah, we've done that wrong. We'll write it up in a deviation, and we'll get the quality team to sign it off, put it into the batch record, and carry on. Instead of doing some work to actually resolve the problem, they then raise another deviation. And I've seen it where companies actually have a stack of the same deviation with the same actions and the same information already in there. They've either photocopied it or they've printed it out, and all they do each time is they put the batch number in and sign it off.
Okay, I think when if I were an auditor, it would just a red lamp would light up immediately, because if you, so for me it's already a planned deviation because you know about it and you just don't do anything. It's part of your process.
Yeah, but that then depends if your system's got planned deviations within your QMS, because a lot of companies don't allow for the planned deviations. They want them to be temporary changes. But the problem in this case is that they're not doing it as a planned deviation. They're doing it as an unplanned deviation, putting it through the unplanned process, and just getting the quality manager to sign it off and say, another one of these, sign it off, please. Whereas if you were doing a planned deviation, you'd just do one. And you might have multiple batches going through on one planned deviation, rather than lots and lots and lots of copies of the same unplanned deviation.
What do you think about the planned deviations? So do you think they are broadly acceptable? Should they be broadly acceptable, or should they be completely avoided, and the QA should really fight them?
I like to classify them as temporary changes, actually, rather than planned deviations. I think calling it a planned deviation is really a misuse of terminology, because you shouldn't really be planning to do it wrong. What you should be doing is making a temporary change and saying, right, this is how we're going to do it. Now, often people use a protocol or a substitute for the normal documentation under a temporary change control, and then they follow through to the point where they want to change it back again, and they cancel the temporary change control or close it out, and they revert back to the original documentation. But to be honest, in most cases, I find that using it as a temporary change, you often find that they're just testing the water, testing, well, if we make this change, is it then going to be all right? Well, you can use a protocol to do that just as easily without cluttering up your change control system. Now, I know people that use change controls for updates that really should be managed in a different way, and it's just another approach to doing things. Planned or unplanned deviations, well, it's just a label. It's just a label because it's a way to document the way you're failing to do things the way you should do.
Mhm. So planned deviations are a change. So, but companies sometimes think of them as deviations. So the question: do they do enough risk analysis before they implement this change? Is it enough?
Often no. Often there's no risk analysis. They just say, "Oh, we're going to do it this way instead of this way," and see how it goes.
Yeah, because it makes more problem, because then you need, if you it's a planned deviations, you should be able to categorize it accordingly in advance. So you probably won't take some critical deviation and just do it planned. So they assume that's a minor deviation, but how do most of the companies really show that it's only minor if they don't do any risk analysis to back it up?
Well, the way I've seen it done is they just give somebody responsibility for signing it off and classifying it. There's often no supporting documentation to go with it, and they just attach a copy of the same planned deviation to every batch.
And do you know of any repercussions, say, for example, warning letters that address those situations that the auditors say, okay, this deviation shouldn't have happened, and you categorized it as minor, you didn't have risk analysis, but it has a huge risk for the patient?
There's regular observations for not using the QMS appropriately, including deviations. But often it's to do with not having enough thought behind it. And then you're not documenting the details. Like you say, you're not doing the risk assessment, you're not doing the root cause analysis. You're just putting a form in place to say, right, we're going to carry on. And to me, that's all it really is. It's a way of documenting not making the change. If you know where you're going to go next, well, do it. Update your systems, update your processes, and then deal with it. If you're doing a temporary change because you've got a problem with the way that the product's been manufactured, well, maybe you're going to need a variation anyway. Maybe it's a batch specific. And if you want to go through with a number of batches that have been changed based on that update to your system and process, well, you might get them out at the end and you might not. If you're planning to do them outside the normal process and it's outside the register process, although you put a batch specific variation in it, it might not get passed. It might just get declined and then you have to throw it all in the bin anyway. And that's the risk for me with planned deviations. You assume that all the actions are going to go through acceptable. You assume that you're going to get to the end and the product's going to meet the requirements to be able to release it. Sometimes they don't. And that's the issue with deviations in the first place. You're investigating something that didn't go right. Well, there's usually a reason why you're doing it that way in the first place. So if it didn't go right and the product is impacted by it not going right, well, there's no guarantee you're going to be able to release it. And if you're not going to release it, the patient's going to be let down.
Exactly. And I think there is another thing to this planned deviations, that they people get comfortable with them.
Yeah.
And especially when those are planned deviations that come and requested from the production, because they say, okay, we must continue with the production, although this material may not have been tested enough, but okay, we will do it later after the batch production. It's okay, we'll take the risk. And the problem is, when you do it one time, it becomes a routine.
Yes.
And I think that's the biggest danger.
You're talking about production at risk there, I think. So you bring your raw materials in and you've not done the testing, the analysis that you would normally do. And instead of doing the analysis, you use a planned deviation to release it to stock. And then that stock's used to produce a batch while you're still in parallel doing the raw material testing. And that's quite often justified on the basis that you're still using the same supplier. You've used the same material multiple times. Maybe you've even used the same batch before. And it's a new delivery of the same batch. But that doesn't mean that you don't do the testing. So I'll give you an example. So I had a product that was used at risk, and the material that was put into it, it was the same batch that had been used previously. But the problem was the batch was now 3 years old. Now, normally we had a 1-year expiry on this raw material that went into the batch. But because we couldn't get more of the material, because the batch that we'd ordered had failed completely, we thought, right, we'll use this 3-year-old stock. And they said, well, rather than delaying production, we'll use the gap that we've got. We'll produce with this old material and we'll do a retest. Now, really, they should have done the retest before they went ahead. And they produced the batch. And unfortunately, at the end of it, the batch failed to meet the spec, because the properties that this material was supposed to give to the product, I believe it was hardness, the hardness or the dissolution, I don't remember exactly. But it was a part of the formulation for the tablets. Now, they couldn't get them to stay together properly. They were capping as they went through. They couldn't get the hardness up to the right spec, but they still manufactured the batch. And at the end of the day, the material, when we did do the analysis on the raw material, we found that it had deteriorated so much that it was unlikely that it was actually going to work. Now, if rather than putting it through on a planned deviation, we'd followed the normal process and done a retest, waited a week, got all the results back, we'd have known that we were going to throw it all away, because we'd have known that the compression wouldn't have worked adequately. We'd have known that the product was not going to meet the specification. And instead of wasting the active, which is the most important part, most expensive part of the product, and all the time from the people, we'd have saved that. But instead, we added value to the product with the expectation it would then get released. But we just couldn't make it. They limped along. They made it with a low yield so that they could keep the numbers up, so they could keep the production figures up, which was one of the KPIs, percentage utilization of the equipment. So they didn't want to wait. But unfortunately, although they kept the KPIs up, they wasted all the money.
Yeah, so you see, it's not always a good idea to, go in the gray zone and just try to outsmart the procedures, because the procedures are there for a reason, and if you try to outsmart them, then you lose money and you risk the patient. So this is also why all the GMP, also the regulations say that you need to show a validated system and not rely on your quality control, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can always say, yeah, we do the testing and we do the controls at the end, at the quality control, we test the batch and all good, but that's the point, right? So
That's right.
Otherwise we don't need validation and we don't need procedures. Let's just run with it and rely on
See if it works.
Exactly. Now, so that's why I see the danger in such unplanned deviations, that they get into routine, and then you want to you say, okay, this company that you told about, and this scenario, it played out bad directly, so they learned the lesson, I think. So or
well,
not?
you would have thought so, but actually the operations, the production team, got their output they wanted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it doesn't matter.
They were not measured on the cost of failure.
Mm-hmm.
They were measured on utilization of the machinery.
Mm-hmm.
So they actually got the output they wanted and were marked up for failing.
Okay, and where is the management that says, okay, you wasted money and I don't care about the KPIs, because it's not about the KPIs, it's about our product and it's about revenues.
I was on a different budget.
Yeah, that's the problem, I guess, right? So there is not enough oversight over because then there are political games, and then you just lose money for the company, but the department is happy because they met the KPIs.
Exactly. But that's quite a common problem. So old products especially suffer from a lot of deviations. Usually you would want to be able to upgrade your equipment. And if you go from an old process that's maybe failing and you can't maintain it fully, then you want to put it onto the new process, but you find that it doesn't meet the requirements. It doesn't meet the original spec. So if you go to a direct compression process, often the reason that you've done a more complex production process in building up the product in the first place is because direct compression doesn't work. When you produce your granules in a fluid bed dryer and you put them all together into such a format that they will compact when in your machine, and then you produce a tablet that you can maintain in a stable environment. Now, people like to make the processes more efficient. Everybody wants to make it lean. So a good way of making it lean is to cut out part of the process and reformulate in such a way that you can do direct compression. So you get your raw material, your ingredients, mix them, direct compression, but often it doesn't work. And usually there's a reason why it's been done in a certain way. Okay, maybe it was developed 20, 30 years ago, and you've not got access to the original documentation. This is often the case when you buy a product. And maybe they were using planned deviations to get it through the process. Now you realize that you haven't got the same equipment, you bring it onto something else, and you find that you've got deviations in your process and your product because it just doesn't work the way you expected it to. Now that type of deviation then involves a large amount of investigation into the root cause and a lot of changes to your process and your systems and maybe even your product. Maybe you need to reformulate it completely and you find that the product you bought actually is not going to make you any money anymore, and sometimes the projects don't go ahead. It's the area of deviations is an interesting one because we all live with them every day. And if they're part of the key performance indicator when you're doing the management review, a lot of the time the senior management say, well, we want the deviation numbers to go down. But then you find that there's certain times if things are going really badly for the company and you keep getting a lot of rejects, you actually want to identify all the problems. Now, you can use the deviation process to identify all the problems in the process and to prioritize the ones that will, using Pareto analysis, that will give you the biggest benefit. And if those are directly related to the reasons that you're getting the rejects, you can end up with a much more efficient process. So I've seen processes that have got a 40 to 60% reject rate on the batches that you output at the end. And all the company does is they make more product to take into account the level of rejects that they get for the batches because they don't really understand it. They don't really understand why they're getting the rejects, and they don't really understand why the product's not holding together the way it should.
Mm-hmm. But they still run with it.
They still run with it because they've got a requirement to supply the market.
Mm-hmm.
And if they've got a product that's really low cost and they're still profitable with that reject rate, well, they go for it. But then if they try and subcontract it to somewhere else, because the subcontractor usually doesn't get paid for reject batches, they'll usually decline to accept the business. So they end up with an internal product and process with a high level of reject. Now, it comes to a point where it's no longer acceptable. So then you have to collect all this deviation data. What's going wrong at this stage? What's going wrong at this stage? Prioritize it and look at how you can resolve the issues.
Mm-hmm.
So that then you reduce the reject rate. Maybe you want to hit 80% for your first target. Then you want to put 80% success, should I say, not 80% rejects. You don't want to make it worse. And then you find a way to actually get the product out of the door successfully, routinely, on time, without deviations. Mm-hmm. Now, it's easier said than done. And some processes take a lot of work to be able to do that. And you might need to do some more stability. You might need to do some more clinical work to demonstrate that the product's acceptable. And that's all part of your deviation process. That's something we didn't really talk about at the beginning, is the actual deviation process. So what do you do with a deviation? Well, you start by saying, why am I doing this? What's going wrong? You identify what the product is, what the process is. You make sure you've got the scope, because it may be that it's not just that particular product that's affected. It might be that you've got a wider scope for your deviation. Just attaching your deviation to that one batch might mean that at the end of it, you get 10 more deviations. Whereas instead, what you should have done is investigate your deviation in such a way that you identify the scope first. So I used to do the line inspection checks. And what we used to do was start with, you've got a failure. Okay, so when was the last good check? Okay, so the last good check was at this point. You do a sampling plan throughout, and you find that there's still problems. So then you go to the previous good check, and you do a larger sampling plan, and you find maybe it's all right, maybe you've got intermittent problems, and because you've got a low frequency of inspection, maybe you've gone to a reduced sampling plan, you've got a wider problem than you realized. And then after you've done that, well, if you find that your whole batch has got a problem, you need to look wider again. And maybe you want to do a further sample of the batch that you made before that one. And I've been in the position where I've had to do multiple batches just to identify where the problem started so that you can address it, but also so that you can deal with the defective product and be able to take it out of the product, out of the batches that you're then going to be able to release.
Yeah. So I know that many consultancies and there are some trainings where they say you should ignore the small deviations and you should concentrate on the big ones. So what you're saying is it's basically wrong, because you really need to also to look at even the smaller ones and assess them and see how a small deviation, a minor deviation that doesn't affect the quality of the product, but it affects your process. Because if you fix it, it will save you money, it will expedite things, and so on. So you really should look at every deviation and make sure that it doesn't have an impact on your process and the quality of the process and how you do the work.
Well, you should always log a deviation, even if you have an expedited process for a minor deviation.
Yeah. So you log it, but I'm talking about the kappa now, right? So you can log it and that's it, and then it lies there, right? You close the deviation, you open a kappa, and you say, let's take care of it in, I don't know, 100 years from now.
When I'm gone.
When I have retired, you will take care of it.
Really, it's about tracking the issues that you've got in your process. And if you find that one particular issue is outweighing all the others, whether it's minor, major, critical, if the impact of that one deviation outweighs everything else, then that's where you need to put your focus. And you fix that one particular issue, and you save all the time from documenting the deviations. You save all the time from fixing the problem, each individual occurrence, and you get more reliable output. And whether it's minor, whether it's major, it all needs documenting. Usually you would do a root cause analysis immediately for a critical or a major.
But that's the problem, that you neglect the ones that are minor with the root cause analysis, because you don't want to waste resources. So you just neglect it and you close it, or you make kappas, like we said, 100 years forward, or you just close it as human error, is the scapegoat.
The common problem.
Yeah.
It's quite common that people use human error and just return the individual. But they don't look at the system and why that individual did it wrong in the first place. Now, what I often find that the training's inadequate, and it may be that that individual was trained 5 years ago when they first started doing the process, and the updates have maybe just been through reading and understanding the SOP. but often the competency assessment on a retraining is missing. So they're expected to read it and sign off to say, yes, I've read it. So then you go back and you retrain them. So what do you do when you retrain them? Well, you tell them that they've got to read it again and sign it off. And then the next time that they do it wrong, 3 weeks later, you tell them they've got to read the SOP and sign it off again. And then another 2 weeks later, they've got to read the SOP again and sign it off again.
Yeah. So it sounds that the SOP is not that good. It's not that clear. If you need to read it 50 times and you still didn't get it.
Exactly. And that's really the problem with saying it's the operator error. You'll often find maybe it's not one individual operator. Maybe you've got 50 operators that are all being signed off for retraining because on separate occurrences, they're making the same mistake because the SOP is at fault. And the SOP has actually got a step missing. And they're filling it in different ways, depending on who the individual is. And each time they do it wrong, because they've done it a different way to what was anticipated but not documented, it doesn't follow through to the next stage in the process. Because they have to make it up. I was trained in it 7 years ago in this process, and I've been doing it the same way myself every single time. But what you don't think about is scope creep. Now, the way people work, they may think they're doing it the same way every time. And maybe right at the beginning, they were doing it exactly the way that they were trained. But they've had more training since then. And maybe it was a different SOP that they were trained in. But when they got their update, they then applied it across the board to that product, as well as the 6 other products they were supposed to apply it to. Now, because that wasn't clear in the training, and because that one still needed to be done exactly the same way that it was, because it's a really old product, then you end up with deviations on that one, even though the people are following their training. And then their retraining emphasizes what they shouldn't be doing on that product.
I think that the point about the SOPs, that people don't follow the SOPs to the word. And I believe that from my experience, there are many people who work in the process for a long, long time, and they have their own way of doing things. And sometimes they know the SOPs, but they believe they have a better way of doing it, and maybe it is so. And because they find, the fine art of perfecting what they're doing. So usually they even do it better than the SOP describes it. And this is the problem when you have people that work really well, but not according to the SOP, because the SOP is lacking. And when they move on to another position or leave the company and you have another operator, then the failures start. Because he's not such a good expert as the other one. So he will become in a year, but for now there will be deviations, there would be problem. And maybe this is... and I've seen it in many areas in quality assurance, how people release a batch because you have you work with SAP, with SAP, and you have transactions, and you can achieve the same way in 20 different ways, the same result. And some people know the tricks to do it better, some don't, but it's not in the SOPs. And but they work according to this. And also in the quality control also there are people who know the small tricks how to approach the preparation of the solution, and they do it differently than in SOP because they have some expertise. They do it correctly, but it's not in the SOP because they didn't bother to write it down and to improve it.
Quite a common thing is mixing. So the SOP or the work instruction or the test method says mix, but it doesn't say how long for, it doesn't say what intensity, and it doesn't say what equipment to use. So one person knows that it only works if you do it on a sonicator or something, and then somebody else tries to use a vortex mixer, and however long you do it for, the vortex mixer never passes. So they could get retrained to mix for 10 minutes instead of 5 minutes. But the person that knows how to do it knows that they need to use a different mixer. When I was supporting the manufacturing, it was a similar situation, and I think there were I don't know if there was 2 or 3 standard operators that were in the mixing area, in the bulk mixing for the manufacturing, and somebody joked with them, "Oh, we need to make sure when you retire that we get your black book." And it wasn't really a joke, because the 3 people that were in there each had their own black book to know what the settings had to be for the product to pass. But it had never been put into the system. It had never been put into the operating instructions. So in the operating instructions, they had a range. But the people that were in the department, not the managers, not the supervisors, the people in the department knew if you did the certain parameters and you didn't match the parameters, then it would fail. So I was there in the QC saying, well, this one's failed, what's going on? And what I found was a trainee, a new person, was in there doing it. And instead of having the little black book, they were following the procedure.
Oh no.
Oh no.
How stupid of them, right?
And the procedure had such a massive range, they thought, oh, well, we'll do this faster because we can do this at the lower end of the spec, and we can do that one at the lower end, and we'll get everything out, and we'll be promoted because we've increased the efficiency, we're getting more batches out, and everything's going really well. But it all failed.
Mm-hmm. Understandably. And then, of course, there is the point that you're not allowed to use black books, right? So if an auditor comes and finds some instruction books, a book in your shelf instead of SOP, then it won't end well, But but here is one of the problems, and so why do you think is it so? Why? So there are experts that work in the lab, and why do the SOPs don't change? Don't they push it enough? Or the manager say we don't care, or then they need to do some.
It's usually a lot of effort.
Yeah, because I think that involves also some validation of the process, because you change it, so it's a bit different than the pharmacopoeia, and then even it's thinner lines, but you need probably to validate it according to your new instructions, and then nobody wants to do it, so they say, okay, just share the book, send us per email.
Often it's even simpler than that. It's just that the amount of effort that's taken to go into actually updating the procedures or the methods or the protocols or the forms, it's just a lot of work to put it through the system. And if you've got a manual system, quite often it's going to take you 6 weeks to get this update done, and maybe even longer. And maybe at the end of the 6 weeks, you'll get somebody that disagrees with you and doesn't allow you to update it anyway. They say, oh, well, if you do that change, then we have to register it.
Yeah, so I would get the people at the table before I begin, right? So that would be the smart thing to do. Bring everybody who is involved to the table before convince them. Don't do it by yourself. It doesn't matter if you're the quality assurance and you have the last word about it. It doesn't matter. You people would just disagree with you. You'll get a lot of pushback. Just sit together and let the people understand why it's for the better,
And then avoid all the deviations.
And then avoid all the deviations, right? So because using black books is not the solution, and using knowledge that you learn with time. So again, when people sit and they learn and they get better and they understand how to do the procedures better. So before you leave so let the others understand that what knowledge you have gained, and try to establish it as a procedure, and try to sell upon your expertise.
I was auditing earlier in the year before the lockdown, and one of the team members told me that because it took so much time to learn everything, it had taken him 5 months before he was signed off to do the job he'd been employed in. And that was normal. That's what they accepted. And it was because they didn't have detailed instructions. So they were getting errors constantly. if they didn't have somebody supervising it and checking it. And they weren't writing them up as deviations even. They were allowing the mistakes to go through the process, come back, oh yeah, this is a mistake, so we'll now correct it at the other end of the process.
Yeah, it happens also, so that they know. Yeah, so I think this is a part of the problem that usually also in the quality control you have the review process. There is somebody who reviews your work, and then they say, "Oh, you messed up here. Yeah, just do it again. Do the solution again, or yeah, do the measurements again." And it happens, and then
it's not just in the lab. You get the same in operations. You get the same in production. They'll go through and they'll manufacture. I don't know, maybe. Oh, a good example. If you're doing blister packing, and you're manufacturing at full speed, and you're getting everything out really fast, but you're not doing the in-process checks. You're not doing the integrity checks because the machine's under deviation. There's a problem with it and it's going to be fixed later on in the day or maybe another day. But you carry on and you manufacture as a planned deviation. And at the end of it, you do the test. So you find the first one fails. What do you do now? Well, the whole of that batch is now suspect. So every test that you do have to do a statistical sample, more than likely. And you'll say, right, integrity failure on all of those. Okay, so maybe you've thrown away 350 blisters now because your integrity test is often destructive because you use the blue dye. So the blue dye is now penetrated your blisters, so they're all in the bin. So what do you do next? Well, okay, so we're going to have to make it all again. So you're deblistering it. You're putting all the tablets back into bulk, and then you're going to put it through the process again. But you just realized just before you start that deblistering wasn't registered as an acceptable part of the process. So you're actually not allowed to rework it. So now you've got a deviation and you've deblistered it all, and somebody's gone and they've not signed off your deviation to do the repacking because it's not part of the process that's registered. So now you need to do a batch-specific variation to allow yourself to release the reprocessed product. Okay, so we'll do another planned deviation to allow us to manufacture this product. But then at the end of it, we'll have to hold it. And the reason we'll still put it through is because if we don't, we're going to be outside our hold time by the end of the time that we've been done the manufacturing. Okay, so we've manufactured this product once, and we've deblistered it, and we've manufactured it a second time, all because we couldn't wait for the correct test equipment to be ready. Okay, so you do your tests and you do it throughout. Maybe you have some failures that you have to fix, and you realize this is why you need to do it with the test in place, because maybe your process is on a knife edge, and it only just, if you get all the parameters exactly right, does it consistently pass. So you produce your product and you stick it in a corner. You stick it in a corner because it has to go through regulatory, and regulatory say, okay, we've done that, we've done the reprocessing, you're going to have to do stability. So we'll put it through 3 months stability, and we'll compare that with the last stability that we did. But because the process is on a knife edge and sometimes passes and sometimes fails, you didn't realize that you'd already got failures from your last stability test. So you go back and you look at your registration batches. Oh, well, they were actually different. They were made completely different because they were made in a different area, so they're not applicable. Okay. So we do some more stability. No, we can go back to the stability when it was first put on for this process, right? So is that consistent with the 3 months we've just done? Actually, because it was a minor change, we started the stability at 6 months, not 3 months. So we don't know if we've got consistency between what we're doing now and what we've done then. So we're going to have to wait another 3 months and see if we've got consistent data. Because, of course, we had to deblister it and we had to put it back into the blisters and we had to do a lot more processing. Okay, so we've now wasted another 6 months because we couldn't wait a week for the test equipment to be fixed, right? So now the product's going through and the stability shows it's not quite on the same line as the previous one. So we're going to have to wait till the next stability point. But remember, you did reduced stability testing. So you didn't actually do your second point 6 months later. You did it 12 months later because you didn't want to waste too much product doing your extra stability testing. Because, of course, you've got your standard stability testing that you've already got that you used for your submission that was unfortunate. So you continue with your deviation, you continue with your investigation, and at 2 years, you find it passes.
Okay.
And it's consistent. But unfortunately, you've only got a 3-year shelf life. And all your customers want at least 18 months shelf life to be able to sell it to them. So because you didn't wait for a week at the beginning, you've now spent 2 years investigating a problem. And at the end of it, you're going to have to sell your product at a discount because it's got a low shelf life.
Yeah. So that's a lesson for why you shouldn't do planned deviation that easily. You really need to think about it really carefully. Do the all risk analysis before you do it, and don't. It's easy to make the decision like that, but then it's much more work. The case that you just told about is like is really extreme.
It's real life.
Yeah, so it's real life. So it's probably many decisions would lead to something like this that is basically a waste of time and extreme waste of time, of money, and just follow the procedure, do a good risk analysis, right?
You're going to a large plant and they'll accept the failures because they've got multiple batches going through and they have to prioritize the deviations that they're going to investigate first.
Yeah, but for a small company, it's even one batch can be critical. So if we're not talking about pharma giants, but solo manufacturers, you lose a lot of money.
With solo manufacturers with one batch probably would have waited for the test to be fixed.
Exactly.
Because they can't take the risk.
Yeah.
They can't take the risk.
That's why I hope that they make the calculations, right?
Yeah.
That otherwise, if they don't do it, so there is the risk. So Paul, so we talked a lot about planned and unplanned deviations. Would you like to summarize shortly what companies should or shouldn't do to really get the best results in this aspect of planned and unplanned deviations?
So planned deviations, don't just do them an ongoing automatic. Don't put a stack of them in the corner that you submit for each batch because you know it's going to have a planned deviation. Resolve the problem, talk to the quality team, and look at a better way of addressing it. Maybe you're going to do a change to the SOP and then change it back in 3 months, and then you don't have a lot of extra paperwork. That's not really necessary. You could do it through change control, you could do it through a protocol. Now, unplanned deviations, don't just use it as a quick way of getting the product released. Use a deviation for its purpose, a failure in the process. If you've got a failure that's happening in a recurrent basis, fix it. Don't just allow the machine to fail again and again and again and again, just because you want to make sure that you utilize your equipment at a high level. Fix the problem, do the maintenance, and address it. Now, if you're getting lots and lots of minor deviations regularly, you should be tracking them. Put on the wall where everybody can see how often you're raising a deviation. And then just do a simple trend analysis. Have we got an increase in number of minor deviations? So maybe in 1 month you've got 5. And of that category in the next month you've got 10. And in the next month you've got 30. Well, something's going wrong because you've got an increase in trend. Investigate. Now the procedure that you've got probably says minor deviations, document them, put them away, carry on. But if you can see an increase in trend and then you investigate earlier than it goes through to the product quality review, then you're going to end up with a more efficient process. So always consider, okay, I've got a deviation. What's the impact of this deviation? The impact of this deviation, well, I can just get it signed off and it'll go through. But is it really more than I realize? Is it putting it through as a minor deviation, just covering up a bigger problem? Should it really be a major deviation because it's actually impacting the product, but it's being fixed as you go along by changing it? Maybe the classification should have been higher and you should have been addressing it in the first place. Or maybe your minor deviations are an evidence of a failure trend. So temperature management, for example, if the compressor is failing over time, then you'll get an increasing number of excursions. Now, as that goes worse and worse and worse, and you're getting more and more deviations, you're having to investigate again and again and again. And maybe you're only doing a slight deviation. Maybe it's going above the warning limit, but not above the action limit. Well, as it's doing that, you want to fix it before you get the failure that causes you to reject the product. So all I'm really saying is use the data that you're gathering to make decisions. Deviations are there to document the problem, yes. But when you've got a problem, you need to make a decision. Do I fix it now? Or do I fix it when it becomes a bigger problem? Okay?
Perfect. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you for inviting me again. And I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Sure. Thank you for watching and listening to this episode of the Quality Talks podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider subscribing and sharing it with your peers. Stay compliant and see you in the next one.